The massive alien station hung in space like a silver jewel against the darkness, its surfaces gleaming under the light of 3 distant moons. Commander Daniel Harper stood on the bridge of the horizon's end and watched as his ship approached the structure that dwarfed anything humanity had ever built. His hands gripped the railing tighter than he intended, though his face remained calm. This was the moment Earth had been preparing for since the signal arrived 6 months ago. The Galactic Council had finally reached out to humanity. After 2 centuries of expanding into space, building colonies on Mars and the outer moons, sending generation ships toward distant stars, humans were no longer alone. The Council represented 47 alien species, all living together in what they called harmony. They had watched humanity for decades, studying their progress, and now they were ready to make contact. Daniel turned to look at the woman standing beside him. Captain Lisa Monroe had been assigned as Earth's military advisor for this mission, though everyone hoped military matters would never come up. She was tall with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and right now those eyes were studying the Council's warships that floated near the station. Daniel had counted at least 30 of them, each one larger than Earth's biggest carrier. Behind them, Ambassador Peter Grant paced nervously across the bridge. He was a politician through and through, someone who had spent his entire career preparing for this moment. Peter believed in diplomacy, in finding common ground, in the power of words to solve any problem. Daniel respected that even if he didn't always agree with it. The communication panel beeped and a voice filled the bridge, though it took a moment for the translation software to process it. When it did, the words came through clearly enough. They were being granted permission to dock. Daniel gave the order and watched as his pilot guided them toward a docking port that looked designed for ships much larger than theirs. The station's interior was breathtaking. High ceilings stretched above them, supported by architecture that seemed to defy physics. Aliens of various shapes and sizes moved through the corridors, some walking, others floating, a few moving in ways Daniel couldn't quite understand. The air smelled strange, like copper mixed with something sweet, but it was breathable. The Council had made sure of that. Their escort was a being named Zexthar, who stood nearly 8 feet tall on 4 legs, with a body that resembled an insect more than anything else. Its voice came through a translator device attached to what Daniel assumed was its chest. Zexthar explained that it was a representative of the Zik species, one of the founding members of the Council. As they walked, it talked about the station's history, about the peace that had lasted for 12,000 years, about the benefits of joining such an ancient alliance. They were led into a chamber so vast that Daniel couldn't see the far walls. At the center sat a curved table where dozens of aliens waited. Some looked almost humanoid, others were completely foreign. Zexthar gestured for the human delegation to take their seats at a section clearly prepared for them. The formal greeting took nearly an hour. Each council member introduced themselves, speaking of their species and their homeworlds. Some had been part of the council for thousands of years, others for only centuries. When it was Peter's turn to speak, he stood and delivered a speech about humanity's hopes for friendship and cooperation. Daniel watched the alien faces, trying to read their reactions, but most remained impossible to interpret. Then came the real discussion. Supreme Counselor Threndar, a being that looked like living crystal, began to explain what council membership meant. All species who joined were welcomed into a vast network of trade, knowledge, and protection. They would have access to technology that would advance their civilization by centuries. They would be safe from external threats, protected by the Council's fleet. But there was a requirement. All member species maintained only a small peacekeeping force, enough to handle internal matters but nothing more. The Council's protection fleet handled everything else. It made sense, Threndar explained. With everyone demilitarized, there could be no war between members. Peace was guaranteed. Lisa leaned forward in her seat. Her voice was measured but firm when she asked the question that Daniel knew had been bothering her. What happened to species who chose not to join? Threndar's crystalline face somehow managed to convey something like a smile. Those species remained independent, it said. They simply didn't receive the benefits of membership. They couldn't use Council trade routes or access Council space, but they were free to develop on their own. Peter seemed satisfied with that answer, but Daniel noticed Lisa wasn't. She caught his eye and gave him a look that said they would talk later. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, covering details about trade agreements. cultural exchange programs, and the process for integrating into council systems. Finally, Threndar announced that humanity would be given 30 days to make their decision. It was standard procedure, time enough to consult with their government and their people. After the formal session ended, Zexthar offered to give them a tour of the station. Peter eagerly accepted, but Lisa excused herself, saying she needed to review the defense protocols they had been shown. Daniel decided to join the tour along with Dr. Alan Foster, a historian who had been mostly quiet during the meeting. The station was even more impressive up close. They saw marketplaces where 1,000 different species traded goods, medical facilities that could treat biology none of the human doctors had ever encountered, and educational centers where young aliens learned about the galaxy's history. But it was in the archives that Alan stopped walking. He had noticed something in the historical records, data that was apparently open to all visitors. Daniel watched as Alan pulled up information about species who had joined the Council over the past 5,000 years. There were hundreds of them. Alan's fingers moved quickly across the holographic interface, searching for something. When he found it, his face went pale. He showed Daniel the records. Every single species had been given the same choice: join and demilitarize or remain independent, and every species that chose independence had faced the same fate. Their expansion stopped. Their trade routes were blocked. Within a few generations, they either joined the Council or stagnated. Daniel felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. This wasn't a voluntary alliance. It was a trap disguised as an opportunity. He looked around to make sure Zexthar wasn't watching, then told Alan to copy everything he could find. They needed to bring this information back to Earth. That evening, back aboard the Horizon's End, the three leaders met in Daniel's quarters. Peter was enthusiastic about joining, talking about all the benefits humanity would gain. But Lisa had done her own research. She had analyzed the Council's fleet composition, their defensive positions, their patrol patterns. Everything she saw suggested a military force designed not to defend against external threats, but to enforce internal compliance. When Alan shared what he had found in the archives, Peter's enthusiasm dimmed. He sat down heavily, running his hands through his hair. They had come here hoping to join a peaceful alliance, but the truth was more complicated. The Council offered peace, yes, but at the cost of sovereignty. Any species that joined gave up their ability to defend themselves, placing complete trust in the Council's goodwill. Daniel made the decision then. They would return to Earth and present everything they had learned to President Karen Blake. The Council expected an answer in 30 days, but humanity needed to understand exactly what they were choosing. This wasn't just about joining an alliance. This was about the future of their entire species, about whether they would remain masters of their own destiny or become dependent on the protection of others. As the Horizon's End pulled away from the station and began its journey back to Earth, Daniel stood at the window watching the alien structure shrink into the distance. Somewhere behind them, the Council waited for humanity's answer. But what the Council didn't understand yet was that humans had learned long ago that true freedom came with a price, and it was a price they had always been willing to pay. Lieutenant Grace Palmer had never been good at following orders she disagreed with, which was why she found herself piloting a stealth reconnaissance ship into Council space without official authorization. Back on Earth, the politicians were still debating what to do about the Council's offer, but Grace believed they needed more information. She needed to see what the Council did when species refused their generous terms. Her ship was small, barely larger than a fighter craft, but it was equipped with the best stealth technology humanity had developed. The hull absorbed sensor sweeps instead of reflecting them, and the engines ran cool enough to avoid thermal detection. Grace had spent 3 weeks tracking Council fleet movements, looking for anything unusual. And today her patience had paid off. She watched from a safe distance as a Council enforcement fleet surrounded a planet. According to her database, this world belonged to the Verun, a species that had rejected Council membership 2 years ago. Grace expected to see weapons fire, orbital bombardments, the usual horrors of war. Instead, she saw something far more insidious. The Council ship simply sat there, forming a perfect blockade around the planet. Nothing came in and nothing went out. Grace recorded everything, watching as Verun cargo ships attempted to leave and were turned away. No shots were fired. The Council vessels simply positioned themselves in the way and refused to move. After 6 hours of observation, Grace understood. The Council wasn't attacking the Varen. They were strangling them slowly, cutting them off from trade and resources until they had no choice but to surrender. She plotted a course to the outer Varun colonies and found the same situation. Every settlement, every mining operation, every space station was surrounded by Council ships. The Varen were being isolated completely, and the galaxy was pretending not to notice. Grace made sure her recordings were backed up in 3 separate locations before setting course back to Earth. President Karen Blake needed to see this. Meanwhile, back on Earth, Dr. Marcus Allen was making discoveries of his own. He had spent the last 2 weeks analyzing every piece of data the Council had shared about their member species. Marcus was a xenobiologist, but his real talent was seeing patterns where others saw only random information. What he found disturbed him deeply. He pulled up the technological development charts for a species called the Drexen, who had joined the Council 400 years ago. Before joining, their rate of innovation had been impressive, with major breakthroughs every few decades. After joining, that rate had dropped to almost nothing. They still made minor improvements to existing technology, but the revolutionary advances had stopped completely. Marcus checked another species, then another. The pattern repeated itself every time. Species that joined the Council were given access to advanced technology, yes, but they stopped developing their own. Why invent something new when you could trade for something better? Why take risks with experimental research when proven Council technology was available? Over generations, entire civilizations lost their innovative edge. He compiled his findings into a report and sent it directly to President Blake's office. If humanity joined the Council, they might gain centuries of advancement in the short term, but in the long term they would become dependent, unable to solve their own problems without Council assistance. It was a comfortable cage, but a cage nonetheless. On the Council station, Ambassador Peter Grant was having lunch with Counselor Vixaron, a reptilian diplomat who had been particularly friendly since the initial meeting. The food was synthesized to match human nutritional needs, though the taste was still unusual. Vixaron's translator made its voice sound almost warm as it spoke about the benefits of early membership. The Council was prepared to offer humanity a special deal, Vixaron explained. If they agreed to join within 10 days instead of 30, they would receive premium trade routes through Council space. More importantly, they would gain access to medical technology that could extend human lifespans by decades. Diseases that still plagued humanity would become trivial to cure. All they had to do was agree a bit earlier than planned. Peter felt the weight of the offer. How could he refuse something that would save millions of lives? But something about Vixaron's eagerness bothered him. The Council had been clear that 30 days was standard procedure, so why the rush? He smiled politely and said he would need to consult with his government, but privately he made a note to mention this conversation to Daniel and Lisa. Captain Lisa Monroe had her own concerns. She had been granted limited access to Council military databases as part of the standard information exchange, and what she found there painted an interesting picture. The Council's fleet was enormous, yes, but its composition was strange. Most of the ships were designed for blockades and patrols, not for fighting. Their weapons were powerful but short-ranged. Their shields were impressive, but their hulls were relatively weak. Lisa realized that the Council fleet was designed to fight species with limited technology, opponents who couldn't match their numbers or their defensive capabilities. But against an enemy with advanced weapons and creative tactics, the Council ships would struggle. They had grown comfortable, relying on their size advantage and the fact that no member species dared challenge them. She was reviewing these findings in her quarters when an alert came through on a secure channel. It was coded for her eyes only. Lisa decrypted the message and found herself watching Grace Palmer's recordings of the Varen blockade. She watched the entire thing twice, then immediately contacted Daniel Harper. Daniel was in a meeting with station administrators, discussing the technical details of Council communication protocols, when his personal device vibrated with an emergency code. He excused himself and found a private room to read Lisa's message. The video evidence was damning. The Council's peaceful facade hid a ruthless enforcement system. He was about to contact Peter when another message came through, this time from Earth. Dr. Marcus Allen's report had reached the diplomatic team, and Daniel spent the next hour reading through the analysis of technological stagnation. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. The picture was becoming clear. The Galactic Council wasn't a benevolent federation helping younger species reach their potential. It was a control mechanism, designed to keep power concentrated in the hands of the founding species. They offered advancement but took away independence. They promised protection but delivered dependence. Any species that joined would eventually become unable to survive without council support. Daniel called an emergency meeting of the human delegation. They gathered in a secure room aboard the Horizon's End, which was still docked at the station. Peter arrived last, looking troubled by his conversation with Vixaron. When everyone was present, Daniel had Lisa play Grace's recordings first. Peter's face went white as he watched the Viren blockade. This wasn't the peaceful alliance he had imagined. Then Marcus's report was shared, and Peter's shoulders slumped. He had been so eager to believe in the Council's good intentions that he had missed the warning signs. Lisa spoke up, her voice steady and professional. She had been analyzing Council ship movements over the past 3 weeks. Their patrol patterns suggested they were monitoring human space more closely than they admitted. Council scouts had been detected near human colonies on several occasions. They were being watched, studied, evaluated as a potential threat. Peter asked the obvious question. Why would the Council see humanity as a threat? Marcus had the answer. In just 200 years, humans had gone from their first orbital flight to establishing colonies across their solar system. They had developed faster-than-light travel, artificial intelligence, and weapons that could crack planets. Most species took 1,000 years to accomplish what humanity had done in 2 centuries. The Council was afraid of what humanity might become if left unchecked. That was why Vixaron was pushing for early membership. They wanted to lock humanity into the system before humans developed technology that might challenge Council superiority. The generous offer wasn't generosity at all. It was a strategic move to neutralize a potential rival. Daniel made the decision. They would return to Earth immediately and present all their findings to President Blake. The 30-day deadline suddenly made sense. It was long enough to seem reasonable, but short enough to pressure humanity into a hasty decision. The Council was hoping humans would be dazzled by the offer and overlook the strings attached. As the Horizon's End prepared to depart, Lisa intercepted one final piece of evidence. Her security protocols had detected an unauthorized scan of their ship. Someone on the Council had been trying to access human computer systems, probably looking for information about Earth's military capabilities. She traced the signal back to a Council intelligence vessel. The scan failed because human encryption was more advanced than the Council expected, but the attempt itself was revealing. The Council talked about peace and cooperation, but they were spying on potential members. Lisa documented everything and added it to the growing file of evidence. When they finally undocked and began the journey home, Daniel stood on the bridge and watched the alien station disappear behind them. They had come here hoping to join a galactic community. President Karen Blake sat in the Situation Room deep beneath the Capitol building and listened to Commander Daniel Harper's report with growing concern. Around the table sat the heads of every major Earth government, military leaders from across the solar system, and scientific advisors who had been studying the Council data for weeks. The evidence was spread across holographic displays that filled the room with blue light. Karen had been president for 6 years and had faced many difficult decisions, but nothing compared to this. She watched Grace Palmer's recordings of the Varun blockade 3 times, studied Marcus Allen's charts showing technological stagnation, and reviewed Lisa Monroe's analysis of Council military capabilities. When Daniel finished his presentation, the room fell silent. General Howard Mills was the first to speak. He was an old soldier who had spent 40 years preparing Earth's defenses against threats both known and unknown. His voice was rough but steady as he pointed out what everyone was thinking. If humanity joined the Council and demilitarized, they would be completely dependent on Council protection. If the Council ever turned against them, humanity would have no way to defend itself. But Minister of Commerce Elena Rodriguez countered that isolation would be equally dangerous. Earth's colonies needed resources that could only be obtained through trade. If the Council blocked human expansion the way they had blocked the Varen, humanity's growth would stop. Their economy would suffer and colonies might starve. Could they really risk that? The debate went on for hours. Some argued for joining and accepting the restrictions. Others insisted that freedom was worth any price. Karen listened to all of them, but she kept coming back to one simple fact. The council was offering a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Join and lose your independence, or refuse and be strangled slowly. She called for a recess and asked Daniel, Lisa, and General Mills to remain. When the room cleared, she spoke quietly. There had to be a third option, something the council wasn't expecting. She asked Lisa about Earth's military capabilities. Could humanity defend itself if the council decided to enforce their terms? Lisa was honest. In a direct fight, the council's numbers would overwhelm them. But she had been thinking about this problem ever since she saw those council ship designs. Their military was built for intimidation and blockades, not for actual warfare against a determined opponent. If humanity focused on the right kind of defenses, they might be able to make any conflict too costly for the council to pursue. General Mills understood what she was suggesting. They couldn't match the council's fleet ship for ship, but they didn't need to. They just needed to make sure that any attempt to force humanity's hand would result in unacceptable losses. It was the same strategy that had prevented major wars on Earth for the past century. Make peace the only logical choice by ensuring war would destroy both sides. Karen made her decision. She recalled all diplomatic teams from council space immediately and sent a message to the council requesting an extension on the deadline. The message was polite but firm. Humanity needed more time to consult with all their colonies and governments. It was a reasonable request, and the council granted it, though their response was noticeably colder than before. Then she activated Operation Sentinel. The order went out to every military shipyard in the solar system. Construction schedules were accelerated and new designs were approved. Humanity would prepare for the possibility that the council might not accept a peaceful refusal. In orbit above Mars, engineer Sophie Carter received her new assignment and felt her heart race with excitement. She had been designing stealth ships for years, but they had always been theoretical projects, things that might be built someday. Now that someday had arrived, she was given unlimited resources and a team of the best engineers in the system. Her job was simple: build ships that the council couldn't detect. Sophie worked 18-hour days, sleeping in her office when exhaustion finally forced her to stop. The design that emerged was unlike anything in the human fleet. The Phantom-class frigates were small and fast, with hulls made from materials that absorbed sensor waves instead of reflecting them. Their engines were designed to minimize heat signatures, and their weapons were compact but devastating at close range. The key innovation was the power distribution system. Most ships had a central reactor that powered everything, which made them easy to detect. Sophie's design used dozens of smaller reactors scattered throughout the hull. When running silent, the ship could shut down most of its systems and drift like a piece of debris. When it needed to fight, it could bring those reactors online in seconds. Meanwhile, across the asteroid belt, scientist Dr. Jason Wright was solving a different problem. The council could jam or intercept most forms of communication, which meant human forces might be cut off from each other during a conflict. Jason had been experimenting with quantum entanglement for years, and now he finally had the funding to make it work on a practical scale. His breakthrough came at 3 a.m. after a week of failed tests. By creating matched pairs of quantum particles and separating them across vast distances, he could transmit information instantly, without any signal that could be intercepted. The Council's jamming technology would be useless against it. Within a month, every human ship and station would have quantum communicators installed. Admiral Richard Cole oversaw the construction of orbital defense platforms around Earth, Mars, and the outer colonies. Each platform was a fortress in space, equipped with missile batteries, railguns, and point defense systems. But Richard's real innovation was in the missiles themselves. Each one had its own guidance system and could operate independently if cut off from command. More importantly, the warheads could be reconfigured based on the target. Facing energy shields, the missile would detonate and release a swarm of kinetic penetrators. Facing thick armor, it would switch to a shaped charge designed to punch through hull plating. The Council had never encountered adaptive weapons before, and Richard intended to keep it that way until absolutely necessary. Across human colonies, something unexpected was happening. Citizens were volunteering for militia training in numbers that surprised even the military. People who had never held a weapon were learning basic combat skills and defensive tactics. Factory workers were studying ship repair procedures. Teachers were getting certified as emergency medics. Humanity had been peaceful for generations, but they had never forgotten the lessons of their history. Freedom required vigilance, and every citizen understood that they might be called upon to defend their homes. The militia program wasn't about creating soldiers. It was about ensuring that every human settlement could defend itself long enough for help to arrive. Karen watched the reports coming in from across the solar system and felt something she hadn't expected: pride. Her people weren't panicking or demanding that she accept the council's terms for safety. They were preparing to stand together, to fight if necessary, but more importantly, to make sure fighting would never be necessary. Ambassador Peter Grant was given a new assignment. He would return to the council, but this time with a different message. Karen worked with her best diplomats to craft a response that would change everything. The document took 2 weeks to write and went through 30 revisions before everyone agreed it was right. The proposal was elegant in its simplicity. Humanity would join the Galactic Council, but as partners rather than subjects. They would pledge to never use their military for aggression and would contribute to Council defense operations. In return, they would maintain full sovereignty over their own forces. It was a mutual defense pact between equals, not a surrender of independence. Karen knew the Council would likely reject it. No species had ever demanded to join on their own terms, but she also knew that the proposal would force the Council to make a choice. They could accept humanity as true partners, or they could reveal their true nature by trying to force compliance. Peter read the document and understood what Karen was doing. This wasn't just a proposal. It was a test. If the Council was truly interested in peace and cooperation, they would at least consider it. If they were only interested in control, they would reject it immediately and probably threaten consequences. On the day Peter departed for the Council station, Karen gave him one final instruction. He was to present the proposal formally and answer any questions, but he was not authorized to negotiate changes. This was humanity's offer, take it or leave it. Peter understood the weight of what he was carrying. This single document might determine whether humanity joined the galactic community or stood alone against the stars. As his ship pulled away from Earth, Karen stood at the window of her office and looked up at the sky. Somewhere out there, the Council was waiting for humanity's answer. They expected submission or isolation. What they were about to get was something entirely different. The Galactic Council chamber had never been so loud. Ambassador Peter Grant stood at the center of the room holding a data tablet that contained humanity's counterproposal. And around him, 47 different species were shouting in 47 different languages. The translator struggled to keep up with the chaos, creating a cacophony of overlapping voices that echoed off the high ceilings. Counselor Zexthar was the loudest, its insectoid body trembling with what Peter assumed was rage. No species had ever demanded to join the Council on their own terms. It was unprecedented, insulting, and dangerous. If humanity was allowed to maintain their military, other species would demand the same privilege. The entire system that had kept peace for 12,000 years would collapse. Peter waited for the noise to die down before speaking. His voice was calm and measured as he explained humanity's position. They wanted to join the galactic community, to trade and share knowledge and build friendships across the stars. But they could not and would not surrender their ability to defend themselves. It wasn't about distrust. It was about dignity and the fundamental right of any species to ensure their own survival. Supreme Counselor Threndar's crystalline form seemed to darken as it listened. When Peter finished speaking, Threndar's voice filled the chamber with a sound like breaking glass. The Council had established rules that had maintained order for millennia. Every species that joined accepted those rules without exception. Humanity was not special. They would join under the standard terms or they would not join at all. Peter had expected this response. He asked a simple question. Why were the rules necessary? If the Council truly represented peaceful cooperation, why did it require members to be defenseless? Threndar's answer was immediate. Demilitarization prevented conflict between members. It ensured that disputes were resolved through dialogue rather than force. But Peter pressed further. What about external threats? What happened if the Council itself became a threat to a member species? Who protected them then? The chamber fell silent at that question. No one had ever asked it before, or at least no one had asked it publicly. Counselor Vixron spoke up, its reptilian features arranged in what might have been concern. Humanity was asking dangerous questions based on fear and misunderstanding. The council had never turned against a member species. The very suggestion was offensive. Peter should withdraw his proposal and accept the terms that countless other species had accepted. Peter looked around the chamber at all the alien faces watching him. He wondered how many of them truly believed what Vixron was saying, and how many simply accepted it because they had no choice. He delivered his final statement clearly. Humanity's offer stood. They would be partners in peace, contributing to galactic security while maintaining their sovereignty. If the Council could not accept those terms, then humanity would respectfully decline membership. The chamber erupted again, but this time Peter didn't wait for silence. He bowed formally to Threndar, turned, and walked out. Behind him the shouting continued, but he had delivered his message. Now it was up to the Council to decide what came next. Back on Earth, President Karen Blake received Peter's report and immediately convened her Security Council. The Council had rejected humanity's proposal, exactly as expected. Now came the difficult part. Threndar had given humanity 72 hours to accept the standard terms or face immediate isolation. All human ships would be banned from Council space. Any human colony beyond the solar system would receive no Council assistance or protection. General Mills asked the obvious question. Was this a threat or a promise? Karen believed it was both. The Council was testing humanity's resolve, seeing if the threat of isolation would force them to surrender. But there was something else in Threndar's message, something that bothered her. The mention of colonies beyond the solar system suggested the Council knew more about human expansion than they had admitted. Lisa Monroe had been studying Council fleet movements since Peter departed, and what she found confirmed Karen's suspicions. Council warships were gathering near human space. She counted 400 vessels, more firepower than had been assembled in Council space for centuries. The message was clear: submit or be crushed. But Karen had been expecting this too. She gave the order and watched as humanity's response unfolded across every communication channel in known space. It wasn't a military transmission or a threat. It was a speech, broadcast in every language the Council used, sent to every member species in every independent world. Karen spoke directly to the camera, her words calm but firm. She talked about humanity's history, about the long struggle for freedom and dignity. She explained why humanity could not accept terms that would leave them defenseless. She wasn't asking the Council to change for humanity's sake. She was asking them to consider whether their system truly represented peace or simply enforced compliance through fear. The speech lasted 10 minutes and ended with a simple statement. Humanity chose peace, but they would never choose submission. They offered friendship to any species that wanted it, but they would not surrender their sovereignty to anyone. If the Council could not accept that, then humanity would find their own path forward. The response was immediate and came from an unexpected source. On 3 Council member worlds, protests erupted. Younger species who had accepted demilitarization began questioning whether they had made the right choice. Marcus Allen's research about technological stagnation had been leaked and was spreading through Council networks. People were reading about how their civilizations had stopped innovating after joining, how they had become dependent on Council technology. On the frontier stations where different species mixed, debates broke out about humanity's proposal. Some called it arrogance, but others saw it as courage. A few Council members began asking their own governments why they couldn't maintain defensive forces like humanity was proposing. The carefully controlled narrative that the Council had maintained for thousands of years was starting to crack. Supreme Councilor Threndar watched these developments with growing alarm. An emergency session was called, and the Council's inner circle met in private. War Leader Crixval, commander of the Council's military forces, presented his battle plans. The human fleet was small, perhaps 200 ships compared to the Council's thousands. A show of overwhelming force would end this rebellion before it spread. But Councilor Vixron, despite its earlier opposition to humanity, raised a concern. Military intelligence had been studying human technology, and there were gaps in their knowledge. Human ships used power signatures that didn't match any known designs. Their communication protocols couldn't be intercepted. When Council scouts approached human space for reconnaissance, they reported strange sensor readings as if ships were appearing and disappearing without explanation. Crixvold dismissed these concerns. Humans were clever, yes, but cleverness didn't win wars against superior numbers. The Council fleet would move into position near Earth and deliver a final ultimatum. Surrender or watch as their homeworld was blockaded, like the Varun Admiral Lisa Monroe, now promoted and given command of Earth's defensive fleet, watched as Council ships began moving into formation at the edge of the solar system. She stood on the bridge of the Unity, humanity's newest and most advanced warship, and reviewed the defensive positions one final time. Earth's fleet consisted of 150 combat vessels, supported by the orbital defense platforms Richard Cole had built. The numbers looked terrible on paper. 400 Council ships against 150 human vessels, but Lisa wasn't worried about numbers. She had something the Council didn't expect. Sophie Carter's Phantom-class frigates were already in position, invisible to Council sensors waiting in the darkness between the stars. The Council fleet arranged itself in a display of overwhelming power. Crixvold opened a communication channel and delivered its message. Humanity had one final chance to accept Council terms. If they refused, the blockade would begin immediately. No ships would enter or leave the solar system. Earth's colonies would be cut off from trade and support until humanity surrendered. Lisa listened to the ultimatum, and then did something that surprised everyone. She opened a channel not just to Crixvold but broadcast to every Council ship in the fleet. She thanked them for coming so far to deliver their message. Then she offered them a gift, something no species had ever given the Council before: complete technical specifications for humanity's defensive systems. The data package she transmitted contained detailed information about the Phantom-class frigates, the quantum communication network, the adaptive missile systems, and the orbital defense platforms. She explained exactly how each system worked and what it was designed to do. Crixvold's officers scrambled to analyze the data, and as they did, their confidence began to fade. Council military analysts studied the human weapons and realized what they were facing. These weren't systems designed for conquest or aggression. They were designed specifically for defense, for making any attack so costly that it would never be worth attempting. War leader Crixvold stood on the bridge of its flagship and stared at the tactical display showing the human fleet. The data Lisa Monroe had transmitted was still being analyzed by every strategist in the Council fleet, and the reports coming back were all saying the same thing. Victory was possible, but the price would be devastating. Crixvold's orders were clear: launch the attack and force humanity into submission. But for the first time in its long military career, Crixvold hesitated. The hesitation lasted only a moment before Supreme Councilor Threndar's communication came through on a private channel. The crystalline being's voice was different now, lacking the absolute certainty it had displayed in the Council chamber. Threndar wanted Crixvold's honest assessment of the situation, not the optimistic projections that military officers usually gave to politicians. Crixvold was honest. The Council fleet would win through numbers alone, but casualties would be extreme. Human defensive systems were unlike anything the Council had encountered. More importantly, the human fleet wasn't positioned for conquest. Every ship, every weapon, every tactic was designed purely for defense. They weren't threatening Council space or Council members. They were simply refusing to be defenseless. Threndar was silent for a long time after Crixvold finished speaking. Then it asked a question that surprised the war leader. What would happen to the Council if they attacked and word spread about the cost? How many member species would begin questioning their own demilitarization? How many would wonder if they too should have kept their weapons? Back on the Council station, something unprecedented was happening. Councilor Vixaron had called for a closed session, something that required support from at least 10 Council members. To everyone's surprise, 15 councilors voted to support it. They met in a private chamber, away from the formal Council hall, and for the first time in thousands of years they spoke honestly about the system they had maintained. A councilor from a species called the Narration spoke first. They had joined the Council 800 years ago and had prospered in many ways, but they had also lost something. The spark of innovation that had once driven their civilization had faded. They built nothing new anymore, only maintained what the Council provided. When Vixaron had leaked Marcus Allen's research, the Narration councilor had recognized the truth immediately. Others shared similar concerns. The younger species on the council had been growing restless for decades, but there had never been a catalyst for change. Now humanity had provided that catalyst. They had done something no species had dared to do. They had said no and backed it up with the capability to defend that refusal. Vixaron surprised everyone by proposing something radical. Create a new category of council membership called Sovereign Alliance. Members in this category would maintain their full military capabilities, but would pledge to follow the council's charter of non-aggression. They would contribute to council defense and participate in council trade, but they would not be subject to the demilitarization requirements. The debate that followed was intense. Older councilors argued this would destroy everything the council had built. Younger ones insisted it was the only way to preserve the council's future. If they attacked humanity and won through force, they would prove that the council was exactly what humanity claimed it was. A control mechanism dressed up as a peaceful alliance. On Earth, President Karen Blake waited for the council's response. The fleet stood ready and the entire solar system held its breath. Karen knew that the next few hours would determine not just humanity's future, but possibly the future of the entire galactic order. She had made her choice and now she had to trust that it was the right one. Admiral Lisa Monroe received a communication request from the council flagship. She accepted it and found herself looking at war leader Krixvoll. The alien's translated voice was respectful as it asked a single question. If the council withdrew and offered peace, would humanity honor their pledge not to use their weapons for aggression? Lisa didn't hesitate with her answer. Humanity had no desire for war or conquest. They simply wanted the right to exist as a free and independent species. If the council could respect that, then humanity would gladly work alongside them. But if the council attacked, humanity would defend itself with everything they had. Krixvoll seemed to consider this for a moment, then closed the channel. Lisa watched as the council fleet began to move, and for a terrible moment she thought they were preparing to attack. Then she realized they were pulling back, moving away from the solar system's edge. They weren't retreating entirely, but they weren't advancing either. They were waiting. Ambassador Peter Grant received an urgent message from the council station. Supreme Counselor Threndar wanted to speak with him privately. Peter made the journey back to the station, wondering what had changed. When he entered Threndar's private chambers, he found not just the Supreme Counselor but Vixran and 3 other counselors waiting. Threndar explained what had happened in the closed session. The council was deeply divided, but a significant faction believed that change was necessary. They had drafted a proposal for a new form of membership, one that would allow humanity to join while maintaining their sovereignty. But there was a condition. Humanity would be the first to join under these terms, which meant they would be setting the precedent for all others who followed. Peter read the proposal carefully. It wasn't perfect and there were details that would need to be negotiated, but the core principle was sound. Humanity would be treated as partners rather than subjects. They would contribute to galactic security, but would not surrender their ability to defend themselves. More importantly, any other species that wanted to could apply for the same status. He asked the question that mattered most. Why was the council willing to make this change now? Vixaron answered honestly. Because humanity had shown them something they had forgotten over thousands of years. True peace wasn't created by making everyone defenseless. It was created by choosing not to fight even when you had the power to do so. Peter transmitted the proposal to Earth and waited while President Blake and her council reviewed it. The debate on Earth was shorter than he expected. Karen saw what Peter saw. This wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a real opportunity for change. More importantly, it gave humanity what they needed most: recognition as equals and the right to remain masters of their own destiny. The formal acceptance was transmitted 3 hours later. Humanity would join the Galactic Council as the first Sovereign Alliance member. Within a week, 4 other species submitted applications for the same status. Within a month, that number had grown to 12. The council that had remained unchanged for millennia was evolving, forced to adapt by a species that had simply refused to accept terms that violated their principles. 5 years passed and the galaxy looked different than it had before. Captain Lisa Monroe, now commanding the human flagship Unity, patrolled alongside council vessels in a joint security operation. The cooperation wasn't always smooth, and there were still those on both sides who distrusted the new arrangement. But it was working. Human colonies continued to expand, and now they did so with council blessing rather than in spite of council opposition. Trade routes that had been closed to humanity were now open, and human technology was being shared with species who wanted to learn from it. Sophie Carter's stealth systems had been adapted for search and rescue operations. Jason Wright's quantum communication network was being installed on council ships to improve coordination. President Karen Blake attended a ceremony on the council station, marking the 5th anniversary of humanity's membership. She stood beside Supreme Counselor Threndar and watched as 2 more species were formally accepted into the Sovereign Alliance. The galaxy was changing, slowly but surely, and humanity had been the catalyst for that change. Ambassador Peter Grant had taken a new position as an instructor at the Council's Diplomatic Academy. His classes were always full, with young diplomats from dozens of species wanting to learn from the human who had changed everything. His lessons were simple but profound. Peace wasn't weakness and strength wasn't aggression. The two could coexist if you had the courage to defend your principles without using them to harm others. On Earth, Marcus Allen published his completed research on galactic civilizations and technological development. His work became required reading across council space, sparking conversations about innovation and independence that continued for years. Some species chose to remain as traditional council members, comfortable with the security that demilitarization provided. Others applied for sovereign alliance status, reclaiming the right to defend themselves. The Varen, whose blockade had been witnessed by Grace Palmer so long ago, were freed from their isolation. They joined the Council as Sovereign Alliance members, and their first act was to send a message of thanks to humanity. Without humanity's refusal to surrender, the Verun might have been strangled into submission. General Howard Mills retired from active service, but continued to advise Earth's military leadership. He often saw